They then played in a dress that didn't have the logo, so they lost 15 million in sponsorship because of that protest.
I think that there's a reason that it's at the continental level, and it's always very hard to prove this because it's happening behind closed doors. It's very politically motivated. They are getting in rooms, they are currying favors.
They choose to lie to us and choose the most destructive and extractive way of so-called development in Africa.
Welcome to the Politically Aware podcast, your supplementary source of insight and humor from the team behind South Africa's wittiest news show. I'm Celine Chika, and today we're diving deeper into sportswashing. From the highs of the games to the lows of the environmental impacts, we're exploring the intersection of sport, sponsorship, and social responsibility. In this episode, we dissect the phenomenon where companies use sports to launder their reputations. We explore how companies like TotalEnergies use African football to distract from the environmental impacts, and we uncover the dark history of the practice, with a focus on its neo-colonial undertones, the silencing of professional athletes, and what possible solutions to this problem look like. Join us as we unravel the complexities of fossil fuel sportswashing. This is the Politically Aware podcast. Let's get aware. In the face of fossil fuel sportswashing, as sports fans, we have the luxury of speaking our minds. But for professional athletes who risk sponsorship and income when they criticize corporations, it's not that easy. This is why the historic story of the Australian national netball team revolting against their sponsor, Hancock Prospecting, offers a great case study into what happens when players take a stand. In 2022, the Australian Diamonds saw Hancock Prospecting, a mining company owned by Australia's richest woman and staunch climate denialist, Gina Rinehart, pull their funding. The decision followed the players' refusal to wear the company's logo during a match. For our episode, we spoke to Amy Steele, a former Australian Diamonds Netball player turned climate risk expert. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem at all.
So before we go any further, I need to ask a very important question. What position did you play?
I was mostly goal defense.
I'm a goal defense as well. I just needed to know, okay, great. I like you so much more now, immediately. So yeah, I used to play for a very serious team called Win or Booze. I too am a retired athlete like you are. Just wanted to clarify that we're on the exact same level. So into your actual netball career, would you tell me what made you come out publicly against Hancock Prospecting's sponsorship of the Diamonds?
Was more, why would I not? If I was being asked questions about it, and it was just so clear cut to me that was a really contentious sponsorship.
Could you expand on the reasons why the team refused to wear the sponsor's logo?
Hancock Prospecting is a company that's named after Lang Hancock, who publicly made an opinion clear that he would advocate for chemical genocide of Indigenous populations through poisoning water on a sort of mainstream broadcast network in Australia not so long ago. I think it was possibly in the 80s, but I'd have to check that. That opinion was never apologised for, it was never revoked. So for the name Hancock to appear on a national sporting team's dress without addressing the fact that had happened in the past and that they were looking to make amends for that was hugely problematic. And especially given there was an Indigenous woman in the team to wear the Diamonds dress, she expressed to the team that she didn't feel comfortable in her saying that to the rest of the team. They could see the issue because not all of them were aware of what had happened with Hancock was before they were born. So becoming aware of it, the girls wanted to support Janelle. So they then played in a dress that didn't have the logo.
That's a very bold move. Could you go into any detail about what the consequences were of not wearing the logo?
None of the players were reprimanded in any way. It wasn't as though, Janelle lost her spot on the court or anything. Everyone was quite adequately supported through that. But certainly from a sponsorship perspective, then Hancock decided to drop the whole sponsorship of that Netball Australia. They lost 15 million in sponsorship.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So athletes, they tend to face NDAs and potential loss of income, when they speak out against harmful sponsors and stuff. What was it like for you when you played for the Diamonds?
Yeah, I certainly had a lot of media training, even from age 16, about what I could and couldn't say. And there was a huge focus on do not say anything that would impact the relationship that you have with the sponsor. And because a lot of our sponsors were government, that meant that anything political could not enter the domain of what we made public. It was effectively, now that I reflect back, that's a bit of a silence order on anything. So even players talking about climate change as an issue, for a time in Australia, that was hugely political, and it possibly still would be seen by some players as a political statement that they wouldn't be comfortable to make.
Speaking of, what is the problem with high carbon advertising in sport generally when it comes to sponsorships?
Sponsorship is effectively buying social license to operate. So if you can get your place on the diamonds, it's effectively the diamonds at the highest level endorsing your brand and your company. Then, young players see that endorsement and think, oh, great, Hancock.
Would you say that athletes are silenced by deals like this?
Not always clear who's right and who's wrong, because there's a lot of companies that will make statements about, okay, we're going green and it's net zero and it's carbon neutral and the rest of it. And for someone who's just trying to focus all their energy into sport, you do have to do a lot of research to find out, well, which companies are genuine and which ones are just telling a story about being green and decarbonisation.
So it seems like the most harmful companies always have the most reason to sponsor the sports that we love. How can we get through this contradiction?
Certainly there's been a lot of focus on how do we create a network of sponsors that we could start to pull from in Australia and Australian sport, that sporting organisations can be confident they have a values alignment to, and the sponsoring clubs can be confident that they will be shown with other sponsors whom they have a values alignment to. It's not an overnight process, and like we just discussed, it's not easy to see who have the values that we want to align with. But hopefully in the future we can look to really clear-cut group of potential sponsors and companies.
When it comes to anonymous sponsorship or something that isn't so obviously that would require you to align with it, is that something that you would hope for?
I actually have a little bit of a pipe dream where we would give that prime place of logo towards a certain organisation or charity who's doing the type of good in the world that's productive and values aligned. That would be my wish come true.
Okay, that's a wonderful pipe dream. Those are the best kinds of dreams. So now you have a position with an energy company, NG, and you're tasked with, aiding in their transition. So you mentioned, not knowing the difference between a company that's just greenwashing and a company that's actually doing the work. How can people understand the difference between those two?
So I would say honestly that when I started working here, I was not sure if the company itself was more of the greenwashing or if it was legitimately trying to decarbonize. But I think what I've seen is that if the transition is not successful, this company will cease to exist.
Okay.
And so its entire value proposition is in the transition.
Yeah.
And it's not in any kind of thermal generation or fossil fuel combustion any longer.
Okay.
So that's quite genuine.
Thank you. It was so lovely to chat to you and just so in awe of what you're doing. So all the best with that.
Oh, I appreciate you, Celine. Have a great day.
We know the main effects sports have on us, but their real impact goes much further than getting you to scream obscenities at your TV. To find out more about the impact that sponsors and climate change are having on sporting communities in Africa, we chatted to Benjamin Moore, a South African based in the UK. He's a PhD researcher on sustainable system change, focusing on climate justice and Southern African sport, and also the host of the Sustaining Sport podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on Politically Aware.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So let's dive into it. How are sports fans, particularly in Southern Africa and South Africa, being swayed by corporate advertising in sport?
So sport is one of those things that is often considered as inherently good. And I'm a lifelong sport fan, and I probably have thought that most of my life. Unfortunately, it's not just the people who are watching it that think it's good. It's also certain companies that think, wow, it would be amazing if we were attached to that. And what happens then is the sports brands are wanting to take on whoever is willing to give them the most money in most cases, which in very often is the case, is fossil fuel companies, the gambling agencies, fast food, anything like that.
So these companies that would have fans endorse their harmful practices, who are they in South Africa and on the continent?
In South Africa, the betting companies are the ones currently doing particularly well. Then more getting one layer deeper, you've got airlines that are coming in, often airlines that reflect nation states. And then going one layer deeper than that, you've got famously AFCON is now sponsored by Total, and not just sponsored, but like fully sponsored. The one that maybe most listeners would remember would be Sasol. Sasol, the sort of coal and chemical company based in South Africa. They were a long-time sponsor of the Springboks. They still sponsor a range of teams throughout South Africa, particularly in areas that arguably do need some kind of sponsorship. So it's very difficult to criticize it. Namely, Banyana Banyana is sponsored by Sasol. I believe the South African Paralympics team is sponsored by Sasol, and even the wheelchair basketball team. So yeah, there's sponsors everywhere.
So does the TotalEnergies sponsorship of AFCON stand out to you as unique among all the big sponsorship deals?
I think that there's a reason that it's at the continental level, and it's always very hard to prove this because it's happening behind closed doors. It's very politically motivated. They are getting in rooms, they're currying favors. At the AFCON level, most recently, because Africa is so rich in natural resources, and the fossil fuel companies obviously need to get access to those, there's definitely an argument that they're doing it to secure licensing bids and something like that. And of course, when you try and criticize it at this end, once you see something as spectacular as AFCON, it's very difficult to criticize. But then for the next however many years, decades, you've got a company completely exploiting and devastating the natural environment.
So from our research, we found that that's exactly their intent, to cash in on that warm, fuzzy feeling that fans get, when you watch our favorite teams play. But how does that affect our energy transition and our fight against climate change?
Yeah, I do think it's just a case of kicking the can down the road. And I think at the moment, while they see that maybe the social tide is changing against them, they're just rushing to get as much oil out as they can before we shut that off. I'm based in the UK at the moment, and there's a huge backlash to the licensing bid to get the UK to extract more oil from the North Sea. In other parts of the world where they don't have that kind of political pushback, they're going to try and get as much oil out as they can. I always like to think that no fossil fuel company is a climate change denier. They're just trying to make hay while the sun shines, I suppose.
I mean, this fossil fuel industry does have shades of neocolonialism to it, right? I mean, this European entity coming to Africa and extracting as many resources as it can with little regard for its people, Africans themselves.
I think that neocolonialism point you make is a very strong one. You have a French company that's getting, the lion's share of the rewards from that extraction, but then, okay, who gets the benefit from that? It's the shareholders, and the shareholders are, all over the world. So there's this weird thing that if you live in a nice house in, Seattle, and you run a hedge fund, you're probably benefiting more from Total's exploitation of Africa than anyone even vaguely near the actual site of extraction, even if you are being paid. So it's a very unbalanced system.
Have we seen real tangible effects on the activity of playing sports in Africa?
Once the effects of climate change strike, I think people forget about sport pretty quickly. I was recently speaking to a colleague in Uganda, and she was saying how a lot of the recent football infrastructure they had built, they chose the wrong place in the first place. It was bad strategy. They would build it near a wetland or something like that. And then exacerbated by climate change, it becomes completely unplayable. But of course, then maybe the village itself is unlivable. We all know that Africa is being disproportionately affected by climate change, and that includes the sports that we play there.
So if we start looking at the actual solution to this problem, there's a growing movement to ban fossil fuel advertising in sport. And there's historic precedent for this. Tobacco advertising was everywhere in sports, and then we realized the harmful effects of smoking, and then it was kicked out of sports. How did that happen, and is there anything that we can learn from it?
Yes, I mean, it is a very good historical precedent to look back to, but it's not identical. So essentially what we realized, and I think it probably was being realized a lot sooner than it got banned, was that smoking is exceptionally bad for you, and that the big tobacco complex or industrial complex was distracting or deflecting from those arguments to maintain sales. And eventually, the social tide changed against them. Enough people became aware that it's exceptionally bad for you, and that those voters, elected politicians who were willing to regulate. And I think in either 2004 or 2005, there was basically a sort of moratorium against it. Where the industries differ is just the relevance of, for example, fossil fuels to our economy. It's not just energy we get from oil. All kinds of things are made from oil. A lot of the things in this room that I'm sitting around, plastics, etc., are in some way based on what we get out of oil. So it's not going to be the same as just saying, right, no more. But I like to think that it definitely starts by sort of making some kind of agreement socially that this is not the right thing for society. And to do that, we should get them to stop sponsoring sports, because when they stop sponsoring things, we can kind of put them over there and say, right, how are we going to improve or change or stop this industry?
One of the main things that clubs and teams say in defense of fossil fuels is, if the money doesn't come from them, then from where will this money come?
I think this is one of the most difficult things. I think there are other brands who could come in and sponsor them, but I don't think they can sponsor them to the level that they've gotten used to, in the way that sport currently exists. And so it will have to come a notch or two down from where it is at the moment. We talk about fossil fuels, if they are under some kind of social pressure, so they're using sport. So when they go to the negotiating table with a sports company, a good brand will probably not have as much money to spend, but primarily they won't be up for as much negotiation because they just don't need that level of credibility. I also think it's difficult if athletes want to stay financially independent for the rest of their life. They need to make as much money as they can while they are playing. So they're always going to be tempted to take the biggest deal that comes their way, but it does entrench us in an unsustainable system. There is an opportunity there for sports clubs to kind of lead the way, but they have to lower their expectations in terms of how much money they're going to make in the long run.
This brings up the interesting case of Forest Rovers FC, who are setting a bit of an example here with a preference for more sustainable companies.
Forest Green Rovers, in the UK, they're a very interesting one. They are known as the most sustainable sports club in the world. They use their wastewater to water the field, for example. They're building a new stadium entirely out of wood, solar panels, vegan food. It's really, top class. However, they have the good fortune of being sponsored by a renewable energy company, and they're owned by a guy called Dale Vince, who is in some ways quite an inspiration. But there's just not a lot of Dale Vinces running around. So it's difficult to replicate the model.
So if Forest Rovers don't have all the answers, do you know of any models to address this issue?
I think there's a bigger philosophical kind of change that we could take. I like to think that sport is inherently good. And I still believe that connection between, for example, the fan and the player is still there. And that's still a very pure and wonderful thing. But it doesn't have to be a player on the other side of the world. So I would argue in favor of some kind of, I don't want to say fully localized, because I do think there's something inherent about, being the best in the world. And we're always going to have that urge to compete at that level, but some kind of globalization of sport, that you still have your deep connection to your sports club or your favorite athlete, but, set the system in place that your favorite athlete lives up the road and you can just drive up the road to get there. I understand that there requires some financial structuring there, but I do think the reason these sports clubs get in this kind of rat race is because as soon as the NFL or the Premier League start absorbing sort of Southern African attention spans, the local clubs kind of have to get into the rat race, or else they will completely get removed. And that therefore is incentivizing those brands to increase the sponsorship into that. The economists would call this game theory, where as soon as one acts, the other has to act in its self-interest, and that becomes a net negative for the entirety. So maybe it's a case of we all come together and say, right, net negative if we keep doing this, so we have to stop. But yeah, I acknowledge it'll be quite difficult for Orlando Pirates to call up the NFL and say, could you stop growing so much because you're forcing us to grow so much?
I like what you said there about the inherent goodness of sport. I mean, surely there must be a way for us to use that as a vehicle for positive change instead of as a tool of negative impact.
When Cristiano Ronaldo said, don't drink Coca-Cola, drink water, like literally the stock dropped like 5%. So, it shows the influence these people can have. Unfortunately, it's currently going in the opposite end, like Ronaldo is currently in Saudi Arabia, Messi's currently in the US, and they're flying everywhere and living extremely high carbon lifestyles. If they, at the elite level, were to flip, if they would listen to the climate scientists, for example. And then I think particularly it's even more impactful at lower levels. I used to volunteer for an organization in the UK called Pledge Ball, which is about engaging fans with the issue of climate. But it's not supposed to be you should do this or you mustn't do that. It's much more like, guys, why don't we have a conversation about this on your terms within your social groups? And we found that tends to be actually quite effective because people can sit down together with people with similar interests, and we're just spreading the information and letting them have conversations. And once they have conversations with each other, it kind of cascades. That, I think, is one of the potential routes to go forward.
Okay, now, Ben, I want to talk about you for a second. How did your fandom lead you to doing this very interesting PhD?
My personal motivation is I grew up massive Lions fan, but it became increasingly difficult for me to get there. And I was like, well, why is it hard for me to get there? Well, it's a little bit how the city has been designed. We've built a city that is designed for cars, and this is, even before the Cloud train existed. For me, I kind of reflected on that when I was a bit older, being like, I'm being kind of torn away because of bad urban planning and unsustainable urban planning. We can even talk about the fossil fuels of driving everywhere. So I was like, is there a way that sport can have kind of the reverse effect? So for example, could a sports club go to a local municipality and say, hey, no one's coming to our games anymore because this town has been designed very badly and we need more public transport. Public transport would be good for the club. It would be good for the people. It would be good for the environment. One day, I hope to move back to Johannesburg and be able to get on a train that is safe and go watch the Lions play some rugby.
That was a really great image and one that I hope becomes a reality soon. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to continuing to see your work.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Resistance to fossil fuel sponsorship in African sport has been growing significantly, not only due to the climate impact of fossil fuel companies, but also the neo-colonial nature of their operations. To hear more about this movement, we spoke to Tracy Makheti from Greenpeace Africa. It's so lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Why do you think Total invests so much money into sponsoring football in Africa?
That is definitely an elaborate and strategic, deceptive lie to ensure that they actually cover all the destructive projects that they're running.
So why did Greenpeace Africa launch a petition to kick TotalEnergies out of sponsoring AFCON?
Actually, Greenpeace Africa came together with a number of partners. The partner movement is called Kick Polluters Out. We were seeing how Total was destroying our planet, and we thought, let's show our African people what they're actually doing. We are bearing the brunt of this climate crisis while they're racking up profits and pretending to be our side. So it was definitely a means to make sure our African people are empowered and they have the knowledge.
So can you tell us more about the petition and the campaign?
We started out by creating a satirical video, basically to show Total's insincerity when it comes to the real reason behind the sponsoring Africa. We're working with a movement of creatives and activists across Africa. And of course, we had wider allies that were supporting it. Millions of people, like literal millions of people across Africa watched the video and thousands signed our petition. So many of them were outraged. They were like, how can, this company that's supposed to be sponsoring our African culture and heritage represented in football is the same company that is destroying the same Africa that we're in.
Well, that's good. That's how you know you're doing something effective. What is TotalEnergies' track record in Africa and what makes it one of the worst polluters operating in the continent?
So Total has a lot of, gas and oil exploration and expansion projects in Africa that are detrimental not only to our environment, but also to its people. Most notably, the East African oil pipeline. It's a oil project that is supposed to run from Uganda to Tanzania. And this project is set to displace over 100,000 people in Uganda alone. And this project, has already gotten a lot of student activists arrested in Uganda. They also have a big gas project that's set to happen in Mozambique. And this project has contributed to a lot of conflict in the area because they even didn't bother to do, proper consultation with key people in the communities. And a lot of people are also going to be involuntarily displaced. Looking at Southern Africa, they were doing gas or offshore exploration projects at South Africa's wild coast. And a lot of partners, activists, and even local communities, fishing communities that are dependent on the coast of Southern Africa for their livelihood, they came together and they protested. It disregards the impact on marine life and also the communities, fishing communities that are there that are dependent on the coast of South Africa for their livelihood.
So would you describe the French company's attitude towards Africa as neo-colonial?
Yes, we call it neo-colonial extractivism because you can see the so-called development that they're doing in the African continent is just primarily for their own profits and with total disregard for the environmental and social impacts. They choose to lie to us and choose the most destructive and extractive way of so-called development in Africa. So yes, definitely it's a very neo-colonialist attitude and approach.
Can you describe the impacts of fossil fuel use and, general extraction across the continent?
The fossil fuels have been, the major and most contributing factor to global warming. And how we know global warming is real, you can tell from the extreme weather events that have been happening across Africa. It's in forms of floods, drought, and extreme heat, and air pollution, water pollution has brought about a lot of severe respiratory issues. And this is most notably in Southern Africa with the coal projects that are there. We have so many people who are getting sick, and from drought, you can see a lot of people across the Horn of Africa, they're getting sick in terms of malnutrition. So all this is connected.
Do we need fossil fuels to develop in Africa? There is this common narrative that Europe has had its chance, and what about Africa?
That's definitely a successfully, played out lie by the global north. Because yes, they had their chance and they did it the wrong way. That's why the whole climate change business started in the first place. They ripped apart through all their natural resources, and now that they have nothing more to exploit in their own countries, they are coming to Africa because Africa, we have an abundance of all these resources. We really have to look at it from an at what cost expense. You can see from big projects that they've already started.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced. Human rights violations are being seen, and the exacerbation of the climate crisis even further.
What does a more sensible and sustainable development path for Africa look like?
The only clear, sustainable path for Africa is investing in renewable energy. And if truly the global north is interested in investing in Africa and protecting its natural resources while still, gaining their profits, then they need to move their money out of the problems and into the solutions. Renewable energy, it also brings in a lot of job opportunities for Africans in the millions, while fossil fuels only have, at most hundreds of thousands of jobs. But with renewable energy, we get the benefit, all of us. And the best thing about this, investing in renewable energy and protecting our natural resources is it aligns with the global vision and the global needs in terms of, maintaining our environment. Because I'll even say, as of last year, the climate clock for the first time reached below 6 years. That means that we have less than 6 years to do proper climate action before some of the effects become irreversible.
So, Tracy, do you have any special words for Patrice Motsepe, President of the Confederation of African Football?
My message is very simple and clear. We need to not have any more fossil fuel sponsorships of AFCON anymore. We need to look for partners that align with Africa's well-being and integrity in its environment and its people. He can start with, ending the contract of Total in the AFCON sponsorship and making sure that the next time you're looking for partners to sponsor AFCON, they aren't destroying the planet.
Yes. Thank you. After these great conversations, my takeaway is that there are no easy solutions to get high carbon advertising out of sport. But it's up to all of us to hold companies accountable and stay mindful they're using our favorite sports to distract us. I really enjoyed Amy's description of a future where our favorite teams wear the logos of organizations doing good in the world. I wonder how we can make it a reality. What do you think? Let us know in the comments or send us a message on social media. If you want to find out more information or get involved in the campaign to kick TotalEnergies out of African football, check the links in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our comedy explainer video on sportswashing on our YouTube channel. And while you're there, you can also find our first sketch of the season. I hope you enjoy watching it as much as we enjoyed making it. Here's a sneak peek.
Are you a multinational oil and gas company with one too many scandals on your books? Hi, I'm name you can't pronounce, and I'm from Evilman PR, a premium PR company that caters to the top dogs in ethical fossil fuels. So you cut corners there, desecrated the odd burial site, but what you do is for the greater good of Western profits.
Evilman helped us. They introduced us to the term carbon footprint, and from there, it was easy to make our emissions everyone else's problem. It was genius. So what? We emitted more greenhouse gases than entire countries. You don't recycle your pizza boxes.
If you want to be informed about all our content coming your way, don't forget to ring the bell, and please consider sharing the podcast. It really helps the show. We'll see you next time. Stay tuned, stay informed, and as always, stay aware.